I certainly don't incite violence.
Knock the crap out of him.
Like to punch him in the face.
I don't condone violence, and I don't talk about violence.
I would have done well, but I would have been boom, boom, boom. I'll beat that.
I don't know if I'll do the fighting myself or if other people will.
Maybe he should have been roughed up because it was absolutely.
If you listen to former UN ambassador and current Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley, whose father taught at an HBCU because white colleges wouldn't accept him as an Indian immigrant and who grew up to lead a state still flying the Confederate flag while she was governor, America's not racist, it is blessed. If you listen to Republican South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, another presidential candidate who, before Raphael Warnock's election, happens to have been the first black senator from the South since Reconstruction, there's no systemic racism, just racist individuals. America's relationship with race and racism and how we confront it lies at the very core of who we are as a country. It is a struggle, an ebb and flow with surges of hope and gutting bouts of brutal, violent resistance. Our history, a history that many Republicans choose to ignore, is littered with examples of that. Hundreds of years of forced slavery came to an end after the gruesome and grinding Civil War, which ushered in the period of black independence and Reconstruction. But Reconstruction, the brief period in American history when the federal government sought to secure and protect the legal rights of 4 million newly freed black people, could not and would not last. That glimmer of hope came to a brutal and violent end during the Jim Crow era, where black freedom triggered white rage and violence marked by thousands of lynchings as white people lashed out at demands that black people be treated as equals.
What they decide, we still are going to fight for segregated schools. We'll boycott any school that is integrated.
It started off with one every place else. And then before the thing's over, you're invaded. And the color take over the schools and force the white children out.
They say that all of this here, what they call extremism, has got to go. I don't know anything wrong with being extremely right. It was the white people that has taken them out of the slums and have educated them, gave them what little education they've got. Amen. But remember, if you educate a dog, you've got an educated dog.
That's some folks' grandparents. That period came to a legal end with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But true equality remained beyond reach. The election of Barack Obama as the first black U.S. president was viewed by some as racial reckoning and seemed to renew the hope that maybe white Americans had come to terms with their own issues with race. Unfortunately, Obama's election seemed to reawaken America's long-simmering and visceral disdain for change. You see, President Obama was a direct undermining of the centuries-old status quo, which has always been embodied by white Christian men. Their grievances surged into public view with a seemingly unending string of racist, anti-Semitic, xenophobic attacks, fueled by a blossoming social media and a ravenous conservative media.
The silent thing that nobody's really talking about here is the reason that he was saying the middle name
Which is?
times. Hussein is because the connotation is that Barack Obama is a Muslim, potentially. His father was a Muslim.
For several hours, the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin in Oak Creek was the scene of a tense drama after police received reports of gunfire.
We're treating this as a domestic terrorist type incident.
Here's a funny thing that we noticed the other day. People debate all the time about mass immigration. Our leaders demand that you shut up and accept this. We have a moral obligation to admit the world's poor, they tell us, even if it makes our own country poorer and dirtier and more divided.
The defendant stated once inside the store, he opened fire using his AK-47, shooting multiple innocent victims. And here it is. The defendant stated his target were, quote, Mexicans.
History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. And many of the 2024 Republican candidates seem to want to replicate the worst parts of our past. That is next. In his new book, American Whitelash, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Wesley Lowery writes, "White fears may be the defining force of our time, the undercurrent beneath the thrashing of our society, politics, and culture. As long as there are elements within our mainstream politics and media willing to cynically play to those fears, we can expect additional bursts of white racial violence." And Wesley Lowery joins me now. Wesley, I have my copy of the book. It is excellent. I am in the midst of reading it now. Talk about that. The threats of white violence. Where are they coming from, and why does it seem like they're so intense now?
Of course. So great to be here, Joy. And you know, I started working on this book not long after the election of Donald Trump, and I was trying to figure out what my next target would be, what I'd be working on, what I'd be thinking about. I had been covering so much of the rise of Black Lives Matter and the protest movement during the Obama years, and headline after headline on this beat was different than what we'd seen before. We were seeing Nazis rallying at the inauguration. We were seeing a Muslim woman attacked on a train in Portland. Finally, the violence in Charlottesville, or in Pittsburgh at Tree of Life Synagogue, at El Paso, that there was attack after attack after attack, that it was very clear we were living in a moment of white racial grievance and white racial violence. And so, as you laid out in the segment leading into this, I tried to go back to the history and try to place the moment we're living in a historical context, that every time there have been moments of perceived Black racial advancement, what we have seen is a tug of war back from white supremacist forces that have met it with violence, right? And so when we look at this moment, we have a moment where we have lived through the election of a Black president. We live through a moment where immigration is demographically changing the country in the way it's never been changed before, and where we have conservative and political media, and as well as elected officials like our former president, who are willing to stoke this fire, this anxiety, this frustration. You know, by the end of the Obama administration, 55% of white Americans polled believed they were discriminated against racially, right? That white Americans faced racial discrimination. That in that environment, the type of rhetoric and politics that we see leads to violence. I'm going to shut up in a second, but you know, the last thing I'll say is this moment we're in has precedent. It's actually very similar to the 1920s, a century ago, where there was a rise of a powerful movement that was not just upset about Black freedom and equity, but was concerned about immigration, was concerned about urbanism and technology and income inequality. And that movement was called the Klan. And it was one of the most powerful forces in American politics. And so we've lived through a nativist moment before, and here we are again.
Right, and the movement that followed that one was called America First, and it was literally the same thing. You know, it is interesting because the political incentives, you know, you just had Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, in Texas, which now officially the largest ethnic group there are Latinos. And he went there to say he would like to revoke the 14th Amendment somehow, magically, as president, and end birthright citizenship. That is the amendment that was meant to make enslaved people citizens. That's the political incentives that we're working with in the Republican Party. I don't know how you reverse it when they believe that is the way to win.
Of course. Well, and beyond that, though, we also have to consider that Hispanic immigrants, much like every immigrant group, are very likely going to, as they've shown up here and assimilate here, have a decision to make. Do they want to try to assimilate into American whiteness the way the Italians did and the Irish did before that, groups that were not seen as white and that now we would consider white ethnic, right? And that is in a lot of ways the vitriol and the poison of a white supremacist society and a structure where Black is bad and white is good, that when people show up, they have a choice to make of which they're going to be closer to, that they can define themselves and their own virtue by not being Black. And so it's unsurprising that we're seeing that already, and it's unsurprising that we see additional political candidates, not just former President Trump, willing to engage in this type of rhetoric.
And by the way, Ron DeSantis' people, Italian immigrants. You have made your point brilliantly. Wesley Lowery, as you always do. Wesley Lowery, author of American Whitelash. I want my copy signed, please, when I see you next.
Oh, you know I got
you. Thank you very much.
If you do, I'll defend you in court. Don't worry about it.
In the good old days, this doesn't happen because they used to treat them very, very rough. And when they protested once, you know, they would not do it again so easily. We've become weak. We become weak.
And you know what? The audience swung back. And I thought it was very, very appropriate. The audience hit back. And that's what we need a little bit more of now.
Part of the problem and part of the reason it takes so long is nobody wants to hurt each other anymore, right? I don't know if I would have done well, but I would have been out there fighting, folks. I don't know if I would have done well, but I would have been boom, boom, boom. I'll beat that.
Do you plan on paying for the legal fees of this older gentleman in North Carolina who sucker punched the protester?
From what I understand, he was sticking a certain finger up in the air. And that is a terrible thing to do in front of somebody that, frankly, wants to see America made great again.
It's possible you could help him with legal fees if this man needs it.
I've actually instructed my people to look into it, yes.
Grab him by the pussy.